was pronounced dead at 7:26 Central Standard Time. We'll begin our press conference shortly. However, I want to go over a few housekeeping notes with you. Please do not rush the official media witnesses or anyone else who comes to the podium. There are to be no interviews with media witnesses or any others who come before you on state property. You have 1 hour after the conclusion of the press conference to vacate the premises, which will be not locked down for the next 72 hours after. You will not be allowed on the property during that time. We'll begin shortly.
The death sentence of Lee Hall was executed by means of electrocution on December 5th, 2019, in accordance with the laws of the state of Tennessee. The sentence was carried out here at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. Mr. Hall was pronounced dead at 7:26 p.m. Victim Traci Crozier's sister, Stacy Wooten, will now make a statement.
The day has come and gone now. The day my family has waited on for 28 years. Now our family's peace can begin, but another family's hell has to begin. Today will not bring my sister or my dad's daughter back, but now may she find her peace in heaven with our mom. She will always be greatly missed by her family and everyone who knew her. But hopefully today, and in this monster's life, will bring some peace within everyone who has had to suffer throughout these 28 years without my beautiful sister. We all fought this battle for you, Traci, and today we won. Thank you.
Stacy, you're the first victim. We've heard statements from other victims of previous executions. You're the first one who's actually come up and spoken to the media. Why was it so important for you to do that?
We are the only voice for Traci. We've waited 28 years for this to end, and it ended today, and I wanted to be able to speak for her, and that's why I wanted to come out and speak to y'all.
You said you were going to be right there in the front row. As you said, you've been waiting 28 years for this. What was going through your mind when the curtain raised and you watched what happened to her?
I was finally at peace. Right, and we want to make sure, the family wants to make sure that Traci was a victim and not Lee Hall. He was not a victim here. Our family and Traci were the victims.
Do you feel like this day should have come much sooner? I know you've said that in the past.
Yes, it should have.
What's your feeling now that this is finally over? What do you think you're going to be processing in the next few days?
Probably a lot of peace and being able to let go of a lot of anger that I've had for 28 years and just learning to live life again. Thank you.
Now the 7 media witnesses to the execution will come forward and give their report.
My name is AJ Abel, A-B-E-L-L. I'm a reporter Fox 17 here in Nashville. So I'll start with when we got in to the media room. That was 6:57 that we walked in to the media or the witness room. The room was lit up when we walked in. At 6:59, they turned off all of the lights, so the room is completely pitch black. There is no lights in there. We can't see anything. Small room, there's 15 seats in the room. There's 3 rows of 5 seats each, and in front of us were just 4 panels that were blacked out with the shades and a door on the left side of that. As we were sitting there, we can hear doors. We could hear them opening and closing. We could hear some doors clacking. Again, there's no clock between then. At 7:02, you hear what sounds like a door open and close, and behind that glass, again, more doors opening and closing. And you hear what sounds like seat belts clicking in there, and you hear the sound of a pan or a bucket being put down onto the ground, and it's one of those sounds where the handle kind of hits against the side of that bucket. It's a very distinct sound. At 7:10, we hear water ringing and splashing, again, a very distinct sound, and then more of that, there's more water ringing, there's more water splashing, and you hear the sound of another bucket being put down on the ground. You hear some voices, you hear some mumbling. It's very faint. Again, we're all in there and we're scribbling, so it's hard to hear what they're saying over all our scribbles in the media room. 7:13:33 is when the curtain in front of us finally opened, and we saw Mr. Hall sitting in front of us. He was wearing a white shirt, he was wearing white shorts, and they were white pants, but they were rolled up into shorts, and he was just kind of looking around in the room like this. He was strapped in, and it's kind of like a plain buckle, but there was a big buckle in the middle. He had 2 buckles here, 2 buckles here. There was a strap over his legs with a buckle there, and there was one big buckle right here in the middle that all of the rest of them sort of led to. So he was, really strapped to the chair. At 7:14, they told us. So 30 seconds later, they tried to say something. There was no sound, and they said their sound wasn't working. 7:14, 15 seconds, the sound came back on after a sound check, and at 7:14:30, the warden asked him for his last words, and he said, "I need water, so I can't speak. I need water." And the warden said, "There's no water. Do you have any last words?" And he said, "People can learn forgiveness and love to make this world a better place." Those were his last words. At 7:15:09, they started wringing the water, and they put the sponges on him, and it's a very big sponge. The sponge is a lot bigger. His whole body shaved, his head is shaved. The sponge is much bigger than his head. It's also much bigger than the helmet. The sponge is soaking wet. It's a big orange sponge. They take it, they put it right over top of his head, and then they sort of try to fit the helmet over top of the sponge. There's water pouring all over him, all over his face. He kind of winces as the water and the sponge goes on there. It's an old black leather helmet, kind of like you see in old football movies, and they're trying to squeeze it on top of that huge sponge. 7:16, they were still putting on that helmet, and he was kind of looking down at that point, just looking down at the ground. At 7:16:30, they started wiping off his face with some white towels, and at 7:16:50, they took the black veil and they clipped it onto the helmet. So the helmet has these 4 clips, and they're kind of push buttons. So 7:16:50 is when they clipped that veil over his face to where we could no longer see him. At 7:17:09, they started pouring more. His feet are down on the ground. He also had sponges around the ankles, and they were strapped in. 7:17:09, they started pouring more water on the ankles, and then they started taking the floor pads off from underneath there and drying the floor underneath from there. At 7:18 and 10 seconds, the warden, there's a little box kind of behind the chair a little bit, and the warden kind of unlocked the box. In 7:18:10, he plugged a cord into that box. And again, as we're sitting there the whole time, there's kind of this ambient sound in there, and it sounds almost like as if you're in the hotel and you press an elevator button, you're waiting for the elevator to come, and that's kind of the sound that you're hearing there in the ambience. At 7:18:46, that first current starts, so Mr. Hall sits there, his body kind of jolts up, and there's smoking from the left, my left, so his right side of his face kind of coming out right here from the helmet, just a little bit of smoke. And that current stops at 7:19:05. The current stops. The second current starts at 7:19:19. That starts again, his fists clench, his body kind of goes up like that, and same thing, there's just a little smoke that comes out right on his right side, my left side, and that current stopped at 7:19:33. 7:19:50, we hear a loud clank, and then we waited for a little bit. So 7:20:30, we were still sitting there waiting. You still kind of hear this ambient sound. 7:21:30, we were still waiting, and we were waiting all the way until 7:23:56, and that is when the curtains closed. And the curtains closed, and the sound stopped, and it became again pitch black in the room. So the only light we had as the media witnesses was the one that was coming from inside. The light came out, and at 7:26, we heard a faint voice come over, and they said time of death. That was 7:26. They said that concludes the execution, and you may all please exit.
Can you talk a little bit more about this? What you said was smoke coming out of the side of his face. Could this have been steam or like it just? I know a lot of people are going to be kind of focused.
Sure, yeah. And I'm not sure whether that is a steam or a smoke, but it was noticeable. It come in, the current starts, he sort of jolts, and as you're looking around, we're all looking around, we're trying to look at the clock, we're writing down, trying to get as much as we can, and there was very definitely out of the side, there was a little smoke. It's almost as if like you're putting out a match and there's just a little bit trails off at the end. There was not a lot of smoke, but just a little trail off that came out on both times, and it was on his right side of the face, my left side of the face.
Lee Hall, his attorney said, was functionally blind. Was there any, was there any evidence of that in how he sort of reported himself in his last moments?
Sure, when they lifted up the veil, he was looking around, but he was sort of just looking around the room. He wasn't particularly focused on any other person. From what I've heard witnesses say from previous executions, there were people that were looking directly at them into the pool. That wasn't the case here. He was sort of looking all around the room, a little bit looking at the ground and looking sort of as if looking out into space and not particularly focusing on anybody. So you could tell that he was blind. Anybody else?
I'm Will Clark with the Tennessee Radio Network. My notes from this, at 6:57, we were taken into the viewing room. It was a 4-panel window in front of us. There were 3 rows of seats. A family member of Mr. Hall's and a spiritual advisor were in the front row with him. As we got closer to the execution time, an attorney, we believe, joined him. And then there was another gentleman in a suit that was there in the front row with him. The press that were in there were in the back 2 rows. At 6:58, they turned off the lights. We were able to get some light from a door being cracked open. You could hear some radio chatter, some muffled voices coming from inside of the chamber, and a door closing. At 7 p.m., you could still hear some doors slamming from in there. Some radio chatter, some things moving around in there. That went on for a few minutes of note. Then at 7:05, some more radio chatter picking up. It was just, you could hear it, but there was no distinguishable words. This is presumably they were making the final preparations for the curtain to be raised up. A minute later, at 7:06, you could hear what sounded like some chains, some shackles maybe, that were rattling in there. Some voices. Again, you couldn't make out words, but it was clear that someone was in there speaking or making some arrangements. At that point, a second minister came into the room, sat in the last row. 7:07, you could hear a cough from in there and what sounded like possibly some straps and a bucket moving around within the chamber. More handcuff sounds and some metallic clicking as that went on. The bucket moving around, that went on for several minutes. At 7:10, you could hear what sounded like water dripping into a sponge, and some more voices again. Not any distinct words, just voices coming from the chamber. At 7:11, there were more chain sounds coming from inside of there, followed by a voice. There was, I caught something about a control room. At 7:12, there was a door buzz. The second lawyer that I referenced earlier arrived, and then that's right before the curtain opened, and we could see Mr. Hall. He was already strapped into the seat. He was looking around, and not in anything in particular. Seemed as if he was just trying to take in the room. He did not appear to be focusing in on any one direction, any one window, any one person. At 7:14, as the final preparations were being made before the warden spoke, he had his eyes closed and was looking down for a second. At 7:14, the warden asked him if he had any final words. He did ask for a drink of water, and then the final words, and what I caught was, people need to learn forgiveness and love and make this world a better place. He then concluded his remarks, looked down, his face was wiped as they put the large sponge on, and it looked maybe the size of his head, and then maybe an inch or so around kind of almost just like putting a thick towel on. Did appear to be a sea sponge type thing. That's when the headpiece was put on. The face shroud was put on. There were some loud snaps as that was attached on. His white shirt at this point appeared to be soaked. You could kind of make out some aspects of his chest through the white soaked shirt, and what appeared to be white pants rolled up to about knee level, and that's where the ankle sponges and ankle straps were attached. At 7:18, a gentleman in a suit came over to the side of the chair and hooked power to the chair. It was at that time also that the exhaust fan in the room came on. It just sounded not too terribly uncommon, what you would hear in a restroom, maybe with a little more power. And then at later in the 7:18 minute, the power was applied to the seat. He appeared to me as if he kind of arched his back a little bit as the electricity was going through him. You could see the wisp of steam or smoke, whatever it was, coming off the side of his head. That first jolt ended at 7:19. He went limp. The second one started, give or take 20 seconds after that one stopped. He went limp for the final time by what I saw on the clock at 7:19 and 36 seconds. There was a wisp of smoke in that second jolt as well. Water was still dripping from the legs at that point. His hands were balled up almost kind of, not in a fist, but maybe like a C shape on the armrests. He didn't appear to be gripping anything, but they were red. At that point, the three men in the room, the warden and presumably the two deputy wardens, remained in their positions and did not move. There was no movement whatsoever detected from the time of the last jolt ending until the curtain closed at 7:23, and at that point you could hear what sounded like latches maybe being undone, some metallic clanging in there, some fans. The fan went off. You could hear a door closing. A family member in the front row let out a deep sigh. There was no other sign of emotion that I caught from that individual. And what we then heard was time of death 7:26. That concludes the execution of inmate Lee Hall. Please exit this time. We were in the room for another 3 to 4 minutes. You could hear what sounded like the preparations for getting Mr. Hall out of the chair and his final disposition, and then we were taken out of the room at 7:31.
Claudia Coco, Channel 3, Chattanooga and Coco, COCO. I had us walking into the witness chamber at 6:56. The spiritual advisor walked into the room as well. He started speaking with the brother in the front row. The brother asked if he was okay, and the spiritual advisor actually answered him in this conversation. He said he enjoyed his last meal. They laughed and they cried. Apparently, Lee Hall offered to share his last meal with the spiritual advisor. And then at that time, we could only see light through a small crack in the door and the light off of the phone in the room. The spiritual advisor also said that Hall was going to say the Lord's Prayer when they put the veil over his head. Around 7:01, I could hear the corrections radio going off, and we heard some doors shut. The room's really small. There's about 4 viewing windows. There's 3 rows of 5 chairs, 4 speakers in the room. We heard more opening and closing of doors. There was one really loud slam, and we could hear voices, but they were very muffled. At 7:07, I heard something like shackles coming off and some coughing and more clips, and sometimes it sounded like snaps, and it made sense once the curtain came up because the straps almost look like airplane belt buckles, and then one in the middle looks like a child's car seat buckle. Again, we heard a woman's voice at one point and muffled voices at 7:10. Curtain was still down at 7:11, but we could still hear the radio going. At 7:12, the attorneys walked into the room, heard another noise, wasn't sure, but at 7:13, the curtain raised and we saw Lee Hall. He was completely shaved. He was looking around, wasn't focusing in on anything in particular. At one point, he had his eyes closed and his head was leaning back against the chair. At that point, they did 2 sound checks because the speakers weren't working in the room. And then at that point, the warden at 7:14 asked, "Do you have any last words?" He did ask for he said, I can't talk, can I have a cup of water? And the warden again said, do you have any last words? And I had, people can learn hope, forgiveness, and love, and can make this world a better place. At 7:15, the soaked sponge, they started squeezing it over his head. It was a really large sponge. It was around his head, a little bit wider than his head, and it looked at some point through the water, he was trying to breathe through his mouth, and his head was kind of down, and his chin was closer to his chest. And at 7:16, they strapped the chin strap on. His hands were relaxed, and they put the veil over his face at 7:16. At 7:17, they started using the water bottles to soak the sponges at his ankles, and they started taking the rubber mats away and wiping down the floor. Those guards left, and then there was only 3 people left in the room at that point. The exhaust fan turned on, and at 7:18, I'm sorry, before that, the cord was plugged into the chair, and at 7:18, the first current went through. His body raised up, his hands clenched into fists. That jolt went for about 20 seconds, and then his whole body relaxed and sagged into the chair. It was in that period of downtime I noticed that his shirt was just soaking wet. It was a white cotton shirt. Then the second current went through it at 7:19. I did notice smoke both times from the right side of his head. His hands relaxed. Now, at that point, after the second current, I noticed that his hands were so red they were almost purple. The men in the room were staring ahead. You could kind of see Hall's head sagging to the side. We kind of waited for a minute. One of the men in the room was staring at Hall's ankles or feet. He was looking down towards Hall. They all looked very somber and solemn. At 7:23, the curtain lowered and we heard clicking. And at 7:26, the exhaust fan went off and we heard the time of death get called at 7:26. And then we waited in the room for a few more minutes. And then we were let out.
So you would classify this as smoke as well?
I don't know if it was, I'm not at liberty to say if it was smoke or vapor or anything like that, but it was some sort of smokish like thing coming from his head.
Do you have any idea like how long it lasted, like a second?
It was several seconds. It happened, I would say midway through each current, but I noticed the smoke, water vapor-ish type every time. So.
Any signs of distress, discomfort, anything that accompanied that plastic smoke or steam?
No, he was very securely, he was very secure in the chair. His body sagged, completely relaxed each time.
Was there any movement after the first time the current was turned off?
No, his fists were clenched and then they kind of relaxed. His 2 fingers, his index finger and his middle finger kind of relaxed with it. But no movement after the first current and no movement after the second.
You said you heard from a spiritual advisor in the room that Hall offered to share his final meal with that gentleman. Can you express in what sense that was shared?
They seemed, the spiritual advisor seemed like the last few hours with Hall were peaceful, at most laughed and cried. I think it was meant as a motion of goodwill. He couldn't eat any of his final meal. So that was a conversation between the spiritual advisor and the brother at that point.
You said that he also added that he had planned to say the Lord's Prayer with the veil was placed over his head. Was there any way for you to tell if Paul was able to do
There was no way to tell.
Was there any change in Hall's demeanor throughout this ordeal?
There, at one point when he said, the second time he asked, "Do you have any last words?" he kind of went, "Pfft," and that was it. That was the only thing that really I would say would be a change in demeanor.
Did you see emotion either with the gentlemen that were in the chamber with him or the people that were in the room?
They were all very somber and serious and stone-faced, I would say.
Hello, I'm Kimberly Crozier. I'm a reporter with the Associated Press. Most of what I have is exactly the same as my colleagues, so I'll be probably a little bit shorter. But I will note that when we entered the room at 6:57, again, we could overhear Lee's family talking with the spiritual advisor, and at one point, I heard the brother tell the spiritual advisor, "Thank you for doing this," and the spiritual advisor said, "Well, he's a special guy," and so they were going back and forth a little bit. So, like the others before me have already said, the curtain went up. We could see Mr. Hall. He was bald, he wearing rolled up pants, a white T-shirt. He was tapping his hands on the side of the chair that he was already strapped into. We didn't see him go into the chair. He was already in by the time the curtain went up. Looking around the room, looking down, nowhere in particular. There was, again, some back and forth dialogue when he was asked for his last words. He immediately said, "I could use a drink of water first." Warden again asked, or the official asked again, "What are your last words?" He seemed to stop midway. He was about to say, I think, or "I think," but then we definitely heard people can learn forgiveness and love, and this will make this world a better place. The shroud was placed on his head shortly after, the sponge and the helmet, as well as water on his ankles. The cord was connected to the chair. We heard the whirring sound. I must confess, I did not see the smoke coming out of his head on the first jolt, but I'm not disputing that it didn't happen. I was looking at his hands because I noticed while his hands were clenched, his right pinky was jutted out with that first jolt. So I was focused on his hands for that first jolt. I did see the smoke steam during this second jolt, and I have seen one other electrocution here in Tennessee that did not happen during the first time, so this was a new thing for me to watch. I was not expecting that. Again, I don't know if it was steam. I don't know if it was smoke. There was no way for us to tell, since there was a glass, we couldn't smell anything. The body stayed slumped. His head was, drastically to the right. And the curtain went back down, and the time of death was announced at 7:26.
Kimberly, you mentioned that you have seen another electrocution here. Anything else kind of that you were paying more attention to this time? You mentioned the difference in not seeing that steam/smoke the first time. Anything else that was different this time, something that you paid more attention to?
It's a good question. You would think that maybe I would be a little bit more prepared, but I still, when you see a body jolt that first time, it still kind of caught me off guard. I was looking, I have to say, I was looking for his hands because after the first time I didn't always catch that Mr. Zagorski's pinky went during the first execution that I watched. So that's why the second time I wanted to make sure that's what I wanted to catch. But I have to say the rest of it was very routine. The only difference was that there were, along with Mr. Hall's attorneys, there was his family and the spiritual advisor in there, which was different from my previous experience. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Samantha Max with Nashville Public Radio. I don't want to repeat what my colleagues have already said, but I'll kind of just describe a little bit of what it actually looked like when he was in the chair. So when that first current started, I have that it started at 7:18 and 46 seconds, and you could see his entire body kind of lift from the chair. His rear end was no longer in the chair, and his hands were completely clenched. Before the current started, his hands were almost a little purplish because they were clenched so tightly. And then at 7:19:05, he returned back into the chair, and his hands completely relaxed. And then he rose back up at 7:19 and 20 seconds. I also noticed that puff. I only saw it the second time, but I think I was also mostly paying attention to his hands the first time. And then at 7:19:35, he returned back down. His hands once again relaxed. The spiritual advisor at that point patted Mr. Hall's brother on the back. By 7:20 and 3 seconds, his hands were starting to turn red. They were no longer purple like they had been before. And by 7:22 and 50 seconds, his hands had started turning blue. At 7:23 and 50 seconds, that's when they lowered the curtain. You could still hear the humming noise until 7:26, when you could kind of hear some mumbling in the room. That's when I guess the medical examiner came in. At 7:26, he was declared dead. And then at 7:27, Mr. Hall's brother leaned back in his chair, and he said now he's free. So I guess those are all the new things I have to add.
Hello, I'm Mariah Timms from the Tennessean. I also don't want to go back over too much of what my colleagues have said. My timestamps match pretty much exactly, except maybe a few hundredths of seconds different. I also noticed, let me start earlier, when we were able to first see Mr. Hall, he was sitting in the chair. He was sort of loose-limbed, sort of slumped down in the chair. He looked quite small compared to the electric chair, which is quite large. He did speak to the warden. I also heard him say something like, I think, or I thank, peace. People can learn love and forgiveness and make the world a better place. That's all I have to say. And then the procedure went forward. I saw the steam or smoke-like something that came out around the same time. It was difficult to tell what it was, but it was pure white, as far as I could tell. I think the description of a match or blowing out a candle would be a good description of the way it flowed from Mr. Hall's head. Similarly, I noticed the color changes of his hands. I did not notice, but wasn't watching for his pinkies. I don't believe after the first current he ever fully relaxed. It was more just that his body slumped down. Didn't seem to be any further action at that point. I did notice, and I want to be careful to describe this. I believe his shirt was perfectly white at the beginning. I did notice at about 7:19, after the second jolt, that there was then what seemed to be a reddish liquid that had dropped onto his shirt front, and it stayed there, slightly soaking into the wet shirt until the curtains were closed. After that, there was silence in the room. There was no obvious signs of movement from Mr. Hall and from the chair, and I think everything else matches. Any other questions? Thank you.
My name is John Spraggins. I am one of Lee Hall's attorneys, and I was the defense counsel witness tonight. I have some wishes, a statement that Lee has asked me to read, and I have a statement from the family that I will read after that. I'm not going to recount my experience of the execution tonight, and I'm not going to take questions. This is Lee Hall's statement. I'm sorry for the pain I caused Jean and all Traci's family. I ask for your forgiveness, and I hope and pray that someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me. I'm sorry for the pain I've caused my brother David and my mother and my family. I hope this brings peace, and I don't want them to worry about me anymore. This is a statement from Lee Hall's family. We are devastated by the loss of Traci and now Lee. Lee loved Traci more than anything, and we welcomed her into our family and love her too. We also love Lee and wish that we could have changed the events of that tragic day. Lee did not intend to cause her death, nor the pain she endured. He admitted the truth and accepted his punishment. He also accepted Jesus Christ and only wishes for the Crozier family to accept his sincere apology and hopes they find the peace and closure they so deserve. Lee and his family want to extend a thank you to all the prison staff and inmates in Unit 2 for their support and assistance to Lee through the loss of his vision. We also want to thank all the attorneys and staff who represented him. We deeply appreciate the love and kindness that our friends and church members have shown us and for keeping us in your prayers through these difficult times. Now we have all lost, but we find peace in knowing that they are both with the Lord. Thank you, the Lee Hall family. John is John, Spraggins, Spragens.
This concludes our press conference. Please remember there are to be no media witness interviews on property. You must do those off property. You have until 9:20 to vacate the premises.